Welcome to the ICOR June webinar. We are excited to have you here today. We have actually our largest set of registrations we've had all year, so welcome. This is proving to be a topic that many people struggle with, which is this idea of risk appetite. And so I found these little risky guys that are sort of symbolizing our risks that we all face in different parts of what we do every day at work as well as at home. And some organizations can tolerate a lot of risk, and other organizations can't tolerate anything. They don't want to deal with any kind of risk at all. And this is what we're going to talk about today, is how are you going to look at this idea of risk appetite. So my name is Linda Nelson, and I'm the ICOR president. And I serve as an expert on the ISO 22301 Technical Committee. It's actually called Technical Committee 292. It was 223 at one time. I also am the instructor of ICOR's Business Continuity Management System courses, from implementing ISO 22301 to our assessor course to the lead auditor course. So while my experience started from business continuity, this topic today, while it will reference business continuity, risk appetite is relevant to any discipline that manages risk. So our webinar objectives today are about understanding the purpose and importance of the risk appetite statement, and I want us to consider the word statements in plural, because it isn't just about one statement, but for the purposes of this webinar, we might want to be thinking about one, but I want you to also think about in practical purposes that organizations don't just have one state of risk appetite. They have many different ones depending on the different parts of what they do. And then we're also going to provide guidance on how to document your organization's risk appetite as it relates to business continuity management, as well as managing risk throughout the organization. This webinar is actually a little bit longer than some of ours, so normally we have questions at the end. I'm going to try to make sure that we get to being able to do questions at the end, but if we don't have time, I will personally answer all of the questions, and I'll send an email out to all of the attendees with both the questions and the answers. So please use the questions button as you go through the webinar to make sure that I do capture your questions as well as answer those, whether they're during this webinar or afterwards. So let's start with our poll. I always like to start with the poll. And which of the following best describes your role in your organization? And I'd like you to choose all that apply. And what I did was combine all of the risk disciplines. So when you see here, we've got business continuity, information technology, information security. The EM stands for emergency management. The FM stands for facility management. And then the CE stands for critical environments such as data centers. So I'd like you to choose, whether risk is part of what you do or not. And I'd also like you to choose then kind of what level are you in the organization. Do you work from outside the organization as a consultant? Are you more on, in the middle management side of things, or are you in the senior management role? And we'll give you a couple more seconds to answer that.
Hi, Linda. This is Margot. We've got about 74% saying that they're managing risk within a discipline, such as the topics mentioned. On the low side of where they are in the organization, 9% are decision makers, and 34% are in the consultant ranks.
All right, interesting. And it isn't surprising to me that most of you here today are within one of the disciplines. But it's also surprising to me that we have 6% of people actually where managing risk isn't part of what you currently do. So I find that really interesting. And actually, in the questions tab, go ahead and tell me why you're attending today, because that has me curious. I'm thrilled that you're here today, but it also has me curious. So yesterday, I was taking a look at this presentation, and I was like, I just want to see what's in the news, because I'd heard something on the radio actually, and I wanted to see what is the news saying about risk appetite, which is not normally something that I look for. And I was really surprised to see that there was coverage in a lot of different news areas about the dollar rising because of on a failing risk appetite. And this was, like I said, on Tuesday, I guess it was. And this is looking at how both the U.S. dollar, and I'm sorry, I don't know what XAU is. It's a different kind of dollar, I'm assuming, moves sideways near the 1280 despite shifting risk appetite. So looking at the value of actually the dollar across different countries based on risk appetite. Also looked at the trade war talk is weighing on global risk appetite, resulting in a weaker rand. And they were talking about all this trade war talk between the U.S. and China was one of the key features appearing to drain risk appetite for risky assets, and notably equities. And this makes sense to me. Both of these news items were based on trade talks and the value of the dollar based on different markets in the U.S. And this is where you most often see information about risk appetite. There was also an award given to SunTrust as the Bank of the Year because they used a risk appetite framework to help them give a clearer view of their non-financial risks. And this was really interesting to me, was because they said they wanted to get an equal focus on their financial and their non-financial risks, and they thought that this gave them a much more accurate risk reporting to the bank's top brass or top management. And it gave them a unique portfolio of risk exposure across the company. And I would bet if you talk to the finance people in your organization, they could tell you very clearly about the risk appetite of the organization and different parts of the organization dealing with money. But I would also challenge them to say, what about your non-financial risk? What is our risk appetite for that? And in fact, Aviva investors, they just finished a 2-year project to embed risk appetite into the heart of Aviva's operations. And they actually got an award for that called Asset Manager of the Year. And what I also found interesting here was that the company's risk and control management infrastructure has been developed around the risk appetite statement. And it's a surprisingly unique structure that brings risk appetite to the core of the business rather than allowing it to be sidelined on a day-to-day basis. And again, asset managers are dealing with the financial assets of the organization. But what we're really seeing here is a move to organizations looking at how they can look at risk appetite throughout the organization. And I was most surprised to actually see a job description that included developing a cyber and information security program which aligns with Groupon's cyber risk appetite. And obviously, you've probably heard of GDPR and the PCI requirements that have come out recently in Europe that's affecting a lot of organizations. And looking at those regulatory requirements and also cyber risk. And I thought that was really interesting to put that in a job description. That is the first time I've ever seen anything like that. So I would hope if you're applying for that job, you would know something about risk appetite. So let's go ahead, as now that we've looked in the news a little bit, and take our next poll. And I'd like you to consider, to share whether your organization has considered or implemented a corporate strategy based on managing risk.
We'll leave the poll open for a few more seconds here. Okay, we have close to 80% that have responded. And it looks like we have a majority here, and that most of the folks on the phone here are definitely, looking at this topic, and they're either considering it or have implemented corporate strategy based on managing risk.
And I love the people that were honest enough to say, I have no idea, but you're going to find out. So let's get into some definitions, because I hate to start presentations with definitions, but I think this is a presentation that's very important for you to understand what it is that we're talking about. And so, by the way, everything that's on the slides, the final slide will have their different references, and this presentation will be available to you recorded after the webinar. It'll probably be, today's Wednesday, it'll probably be available on Friday on our webpage, our webinar webpage. So you can go back and look at those references as well. I also wanted to remind you that you will also receive CEU points, so you'll get a certificate of attendance for that as well. So anyways, back to the definition. And COSO is an organization that a lot of people use as a reference, and they also have to align to some of the things that they do. And ERM stands for Enterprise Risk Management. So they've defined risk management or risk appetite as the amount of risk on a broad level an entity is willing to accept in pursuit of value. And risk appetite reflects the entity's risk management philosophy and in turn influences the entity's culture as well as operating style. They also say that risk appetite guides resource allocation, and it assists the organization in aligning the organization, its people, and processes as part of designing the infrastructure necessary to effectively respond to and monitor risks. So here they're looking at all types of risks. Enterprise risk management is not just about financial risk. So we're talking about operational risk or anything else, however else your organization defines risk. So here the question is your organization risk averse? Do they hide? Do they not want to do anything? Or are they ready to live on the edge, ready to try anything? And you're going to see this sometimes even within organizations, that any part of the organization that deals with money is going to be very risk averse. But maybe your R&D department, they have a lot more flexibility with what they can do. And companies themselves that are all about getting out the next product line are probably going to be less risk averse, again, than any kind of financial institution. An insurance organization, anybody who's regulated are going to be much more risk averse. So KPMG wrote a paper on risk appetite that I thought was really helpful because they made it very practical, and they had some thoughts. They said, when risk appetite is properly understood and clearly defined, it becomes a powerful tool not only for managing risk in your organization, but also for enhancing overall business performance. They also use a similar definition to COSO, which is the amount of risk on a broad level that an organization is willing to take on in pursuit of value. Also, they say it's how an organization wishes to be perceived by key stakeholders, such as shareholders, employees, regulators, rating agencies, and customers. And then reminding us that risk appetites can vary across those business units and different risk types. I wanted to talk briefly about risk appetite and strategies, and we're going to use both the capital letter S for strategy, like corporate strategy, as well as those maybe individual strategies that you use more of an operational basis to manage risk at a local level. So the organization's overall risk appetite and the risk appetite of the various activities of the organization play an important role in the identification and selection of strategies to mitigate risk and reduce vulnerabilities. So corporate strategy is going to be very much tied to its risk appetite, as well as those individual strategies that you're going to use to manage risk. These next several slides also come from COSO, and this identification process is probably going to look similar to just about every other process that you have, where you're going to develop and revise what you've put in place. You're going to communicate that, you're going to monitor that, and all of that, your risk appetite needs to be monitored and reviewed as it's going on. And remembering that it's an element of good governance. So we're going to take a look at who's really responsible for this. And according to all of the top organizations that talk about risk appetite, I'll go back and use the word top one more time and say it is a top management responsibility. So while you might not be in top management, you can help drive that conversation if it's not something that you're aware of in your organization. And because it's an interrelationship of strategy, management decision, and risk appetite, it needs to be driven by top management. They're responsible for setting the strategic goals and objectives. They're responsible for formulating those corporate strategies, for establishing operations, compliance, and reporting objectives, as well as making decisions on how to manage risks and relating to the achievement of those objectives. And so you need to be considering risk appetite in the setting of those objectives. So if they're not using risk appetite to help them do all of these things, there's going to be a disconnect. And it's going to be really difficult for you to manage those risks on the more operational level if there isn't a corporate strategy for how they're going to manage risk. And that's really one of the main points of this presentation today, is that while it's a top management responsibility, it needs to be understood throughout the organization so that everybody that has a responsibility for managing risk understands that they're moving in the same direction. So I want to look, PwC put together an interesting paper as well, and they started with looking at what are our different risk categories. We've got business risk, credit risk, market risk. I've mentioned before operational risk, your liquidity, as well as your group risk. And so it's very much probable that you could have different risk appetites for these different areas of risks. And these tie into what's called your risk profile. And this represents the allocation of appetite to risk categories. And your actual profile should represent risks that are currently assumed as well. So don't forget about those. Your risk capacity is the maximum amount of risk that the organization can bear. It's usually going to be tied to your capital, your liquid assets, and your borrowing capacity, because it's going to cost money. And each of these things is what helps define that risk appetite. So as I mentioned before, your risk appetite sets the bar for risk tolerances, and management is supposed to set those objectives with a board oversight. And then they're supposed to articulate that risk appetite. What amount of it is acceptable in our pursuit of our objectives? And then tied to that, then management is going to set tolerances around risks acceptable at the organizational and or functional unit level. So tying those pieces together becomes important. There are some things that are considerations that are going to affect your risk appetite. So what is your current risk profile? You need to understand that. Excuse me. The current level and distribution of risks across the organization and across various risk categories that we just mentioned. So what is your current risk profile? Where are you vulnerable? Where are you feeling strong? What risks have you been managing effectively? There should be a way to measure that. What's your capacity for risk? What's the amount of risk that you're willing to support, again, in the pursuit of its objectives? What's your risk tolerance? And this is kind of a variation that you're willing to look at. And this is where I think that the terms risk capacity, risk tolerance, and risk appetite are often used interchangeably. And I'm not going to say that that's a bad thing. We're just if you're using terms like risk capacity and risk tolerance, I think you're fine. But these also help develop different attitudes towards risk. And these things combined are supposed to help you determine your risk appetite. But I don't think you need to worry specifically if you're using one of these other terms like risk capacity or risk tolerance or risk attitude. They're really all ways that you help you to determine your risk appetite. The Institute for Risk Management put together a kind of a neat example tied to performance of how these different considerations that affect risk appetite look. So if you look at your organization, you've got performance on the left and you've got time going across the bottom. And here is your current direction of travel. You're expecting to continue doing well and to improve over time. And then you think about, wow, if we really perform well, where are we going to be? And if we don't perform well, if we really bottom out, where might we be? Looking at those sorts of things. And those things put together become what they're calling your risk universe. These are the major areas. So we think if we do really well, we could be up here. If we do really poor, we can do down here. We'll be down there. And this becomes our risk universe. Then they look at, within that becomes your risk tolerance. This is how much we can tolerate. And it's interesting that there's a tolerance level for how well that your performance. Well, it could be that if you look at you start overperforming, and then you can't actually maybe meet all of your requirements. Maybe more people want your product than you can produce, for example, or your services are needed and you don't have enough people available to provide it. And then within that becomes your risk appetite. So this is how the Institute for Risk Management has looked at these concepts, is by looking at the risk universe, your risk tolerance, and then your risk appetite being a subset of that. Now, I said that we were going to look at how this is related to business continuity. So in ISO 22301, there are several requirements for risk appetite. At the very beginning in Clause 4, it says that the organization shall identify and document its risk appetite. Then it goes on to say that when you're establishing the context of your BCMS, that you need to set risk criteria taking into account your risk appetite. So that risk criteria is, what kinds of risks can we afford to take and what kind can't we take? And this, of course, needs to be tied to your risk appetite. And then in Clause 5, here's you're assigning it to top management, that they shall ensure that the responsibilities and authorities for relevant roles are assigned and communicated by defining the criteria for accepting risks and the acceptable levels of risk. And lastly, it says that the organization shall identify risk treatments commensurate with the business continuity objectives and in accordance with the organization's risk appetite. So here's where you get to strategy. The organization needs to document it. It needs to take into account criteria. Top management is supposed to be responsible for it. And when you're putting together your BCMS, you need to look at treatments. And I will share that with these requirements in Clauses 4 and 5 are going to be the same requirements that you're going to see in every management system standard. So whether it's a business continuity or information security or quality or environmental health and safety or any of the other management system standards, they're going to be asking and requiring the same sort of thing. And then in Clause 8, they have specific requirements tied to whatever that management system is. So this isn't something that is going to completely go away. And it's something that you should be starting to look at if you haven't already done so within your organization. So whatever management system or whatever way that you manage risk in your organization, you should be looking at the organization's risk appetite and how your strategies and your risk treatments align to those and support those. This is an example of financial risk that I liked from KPMG. And essentially, they just put together a really simple chart, your willingness to accept risk, low, medium, and high. They put a numerical value with that for measurement, and they looked at earnings availability, capital requirements, reputation, credit ratings, and regulatory standing. And you can see that they were willing to take a little more risk on their earnings availability and reputation, but they were not willing to accept any risk in capital requirements. Very simple chart. So you could go ahead and put together a chart like this and put together your categories for risk and how they might look. You might put that by department. You could put that by business unit. You could put that by activity of the organization or process or functionality. And then, really ask the question, how willing are you to accept risk in this? And it could be something that you could add to your risk assessment process. You could add this to just an activity that you do to try to capture your organization's willingness to accept risk. So let's take another poll, and I want you to identify whether your organization has identified its risk appetite for at least one activity of the organization. So here is, do you know your organization's risk appetite, essentially? Do you know if it exists?
We can have almost half the people reporting. We'll leave the poll open for a few more minutes, a few more seconds. Okay, we're going to close that. And looks like we have most of the folks in the yes category, Linda, with yes, they're using it to make decisions today, and yes, it's being used, but perhaps not in my general area of the organization.
All right. 1 second to get my, there we go. So I'm going to talk next about communicating risk appetite. Risk appetite needs to be communicated in a way that ensures that your operations are consistent, meaning that if it's used in one part of the organization, it needs to be consistently used across the organization in other parts. So if some of you that had said that it's being used in one area but not the area that you're in right now, when it starts being used, you need to make sure that it's used consistently. And of course, it needs to be understood in context. You know, the people that are managing the day-to-day business and those responsible for managing risk within any part of the organization need to understand how it's being managed. And your risk appetite needs to consider the needs and expectations of those relevant interested parties. And this is something that's in very standard speak, but it's really important. You need to know that how you're communicating about your risk appetite is meeting those expectations. Are you using the right language? Do they understand you? Are their needs being met as far as their own personal risk tolerance? So if you're talking to a client and you need to make sure that you're meeting their needs and expectations as you're talking about any risks that there might be from meeting their requirements. So let's take a look next at effective risk appetite statements and how you can communicate those. And the main thing I want you to remember here at the beginning is that risk appetite should be descriptive enough to guide actions across the organization. And this is, again, back to COSO. So they start off by saying that it needs to link to objectives, and there should be a time frame or portfolio of projects. So there should be a time aspect, and it should definitely be linked to your objectives. It needs to be stated with sufficient precision so that you can communicate it, monitor it, and adjust it. It needs to also determine acceptable risk tolerances within that. So we saw that risk tolerance is an aspect of risk appetite. And have specific objectives. Like in the next fiscal year, we're going to try to reduce our risk appetite in this area. And these are the objectives that we have for that. It should also be tied to your people, processes, and your infrastructure. So make sure that all of those are aligned. And there should be a way that you can monitor the risks that you have so that you can help make decisions and operational decisions as well. So when you document your risk appetite, it needs to be reflective of strategy and key aspects of the business. And this is, again, from KPMG now. It needs to make sure that you acknowledge a willingness and a capacity to accept risk. You just can't say that you have a zero tolerance policy for risk, because you can't manage all risk and you can't control all risk. So there has to be an acknowledgement that you're going to have to accept some risk. It needs to be documented in a formal statement. It also needs to consider the skills, resources, and technology required to manage and monitor those risk exposures. So what capabilities does your organization have in place? And this is going to impact your risk appetite. If you don't have the capabilities in place to reduce your risk appetite and to manage risk, you need to consider that and how that might change over time as well. It needs to be inclusive of tolerance for loss or negative incidents that can be reasonably quantified. So here's where we're looking again for a way to measure. And it should be periodically reviewed and reconsidered with reference to change. So anytime you have a change in your organization, you should be reviewing your organization's risk appetite as it aligns to that as well. And of course, it should be approved by your board or top management since they're supposed to be part of this process. So where should you document this? An organization's risk appetite, like we said, should be measurable. And it should have some kind of a time aspect. So your risk appetite statement isn't just something that goes on forever. It should make sure that there's some kind of a periodic review of that and that it's tied to your changes within the organization, whether they're throughout the organization or maybe part of your environment as well. Remembering that risk acceptance should not have anything to do with relaxing your controls or your risk treatments. That sometimes you have to accept risk in some areas, but you still need to have controls in place to manage the others. Of course, it should be tied to the needs and expectations of your interested parties. It doesn't make any sense if you're not doing that. So where should you document your risk appetite? It should be in your annual reports, financial statements. These might be things that you share to the public or things that you don't share to the public, but definitely with your top management, it should be in the annual reports of your company so that when you're making those decisions with your leadership team, they have an idea of what they're talking about. It might be included in your customer contracts. These are might be things. It might be part of your regulatory requirements that you have to document this, and so therefore, wherever you have to document your regulatory requirements is where you will put that. Hopefully it's in your strategic plans at a minimum. And oftentimes companies will document the risk appetite in their policy. When we're talking a business continuity management system, and if you're being audited, the first place that the auditor will look for your documented risk appetite statement is going to be in your policy. If it's not there, they're going to ask, where is it? And they'll probably ask next to look in the strategic plans of the organization. So try to figure out where it is. If you already have one somewhere in your organization, find out where it's documented. And if you're going to start adding, more risk appetite statements based on different parts of the organization, to find out where you think you should document that, because it is going to be something that maybe you don't want to share publicly. Probably you don't want to share it publicly, is my guess. So looking at, your documentation and what gets shared, what doesn't get shared, and figuring out where that you can document it. They also suggested board meeting minutes. I'm not so certain about that one. That's kind of like customer contracts, in my opinion. That one's kind of an iffy one in my opinion, but it might be a place, if your board meeting minutes are completely confidential, then it might be a place that you put them as well. They just need to be accessible to the people that need to use them. So I want to look at some sample risk appetites next. This is for a university, and they did this pretty simply. They put kind of a continuum up there between what was acceptable and not acceptable. And instead of using a number system, they just used the kind of the green to red, color chart. So this is another example of how you might want to document it. And they said that it was acceptable to deal with increased costs due to incompatibility with their legacy computer systems. So they said, you know what, our computer systems are really out of date. Our information security probably isn't great with that, but because of the cost to us to make that change, we've decided to accept that risk. Somewhere in the middle here, they were not as comfortable with accepting the IT aspects or the information security aspects of their computer legacy systems. So they said, we want to spend a little more time on that. And they weren't so sure about reduced teaching reputation. So this is an interesting concept. They've taken the fact that they're not going to change their legacy computer systems, but they are going to manage their information security in some aspect. And they don't want the reputation of their teachers, or their professors, to be damaged. It's right kind of in the middle there. They're willing to accept some of it, but not others of it. And then lastly, they find it completely unacceptable to impact the reputation of their research. And you might go, what on earth? This doesn't make any sense. Why aren't they focusing on their teaching? And if you're familiar with universities, or if you've worked in university, you most likely understand that most of the money that comes in through a university is through their research. And so that if they lose their research, they're going to have a big impact to the reputation. And this is a really interesting thing for you to consider. If you're doing consulting with the university as well, is to look at the fact that reputation actually plays a bigger role in the research side than it does in the teaching side. And then how do you measure reputation? So while this risk appetite statement seems pretty simple and straightforward, now you've got to figure out how to measure that, because we said that your risk appetite statement needed to be measurable. So how do you measure that? So one way you could do it is to say, we are not comfortable accepting more than I'm putting a number here, a 10% probability that we will incur losses of more than, and then you put in your dollar amount in pursuit of whatever activity or objective. So this is kind of a fill in the blank risk appetite statement that you could use. You know, what's your probability? So you have to have a pretty accurate risk assessment process and a pretty accurate way to identify risk to your organization. So knowing that, understanding the probability is going to be really important. And then looking at incurring losses of more than a certain amount of money. How much tolerance can you have to loss? How much can you afford to lose? And I always give this example of, I'm not a gambler, but you know, sometimes you have to go to a casino. Somebody makes you go to a casino to have fun. So I will always say, okay, if I was going out for an evening, you know, I'm going to go out for dinner, I'll go to a show or do something. Here's the amount of money I would spend that evening. And I'd probably, you know, spend 3 or 4 or 5 hours doing that. So if I'm going to a casino, I'm going to, you know, decide that I'm going to go for and spend, let's say, $100 or $200, whatever it is. And when I've either spent all my money and I don't have any winnings, or my time is over and I decided, okay, I'm going to stop now. I'm good to go. I'm going to stop and take the money home with me. That is one way that I'm taking a look at my risk appetite personally with an activity such as gambling. As far as the probability goes, that's going to be determined as to which games I decide to play. Am I just going to sit and play with the slot machines, or am I going to play? I don't even know what the other games are, so my apologies. I'm going to play something that requires more knowledge about how to play the games and how to win. So this is a very simple risk appetite statement that you can use to try to put some documentation in there and some measurability to it. I want to move next to an example for healthcare. And they say that the organization operates within a low overall risk range. That's their basic statement that they're starting with. And then they say that their lowest risk appetite relates to safety and compliance objectives, including employee health and safety, which you would hope they would be dealing with safety and health since they're a healthcare organization, with a marginally higher risk appetite towards its strategic, reporting, and operations objectives. And then they go on to try to make this more clear to people so that it can be interpreted correctly by saying that this means that reducing to reasonably practical levels the risks originating from various medical systems, products, equipment, and our work environment, and meeting our legal obligations will take priority over other business objectives. To me, this is a statement that you could probably share. It's not, you're not giving out a huge amount of information. They're saying that we put safety and compliance first, that we're going to make sure that employee as well as, hospital safety is our top priority. I think, when you're looking at your corporate objectives at a hospital or a healthcare facility, you can say those things, and that's what people would expect you to say. If you were saying that making money has a higher business objective than ensuring safety and health and compliance to those things, any of those regulatory things, come second, I probably wouldn't want to go to that hospital or go to that facility. I'm just throwing that out there that it might impact things. So I want to go back and look at then the hospital, looking at how does their risk appetite compare to their risk tolerance. So again, they go back to a health services organization places patient safety amongst its highest priorities. The organization also understands the need to balance the level of immediate response to all patient needs with the cost of providing such service. So here you're getting to meeting patient needs and the cost of doing so. So then they quantify that a little bit by saying that the organization has a low risk appetite related to patient safety, but a higher appetite related to response to all patient needs. So here's where you want to get down to which patient needs are more important than others. So it gives you a high level, but it would need some more information. They then provide you with some information that they've identified under risk tolerance. They say we strive to treat all emergency room patients within 2 hours and critically ill patients within 15 minutes. So now you've got a measure there. They say, however, management accepts that in rare situations, and they've given you a number, 5% of the time, patients in need of non-life-threatening attention may not receive that attention for up to 4 hours. So here they've given you a 2-hour measure, a 15-minute measure, and then they've given you a percentage of the time where they believe that as long as it's not life-threatening, that they may not receive that attention within 4 hours. This helps. These statements and this direction helps the doctors and the nurses and other people who work in the hospital to understand what it is that they're supposed to be doing. Who do they treat first? At what level do they treat people? And this is where I got back to this response to all patient needs. Which patient needs are they talking about? So I would hope that they have identified which types of patient needs versus just general, all emergency room patients and critically ill. What's the definition of these? Level of patient needs would need to be identified as well. So let's take another poll. This will be our last poll. And to what extent do you feel capable of drafting a risk appetite statement for some aspect of the organization? And I'm throwing that out there saying that what I saw was not everybody was in top management that's here, and we understand that top management's responsible for doing this, but a lot of times they might ask you to write it up and them to review it. We understand that happens all the time.
We're going to leave the poll open for a few more seconds here. We got about half the folks reporting in. Okay, we're going to close it. And we're kind of split in the middle here with about 60-some% in the middle couple categories. They feel pretty capable, somewhat capable. About 13% are saying that they're very capable and they're ready.
That's interesting. And again, the 7% that says, not within my scope of work at this time, I'm thrilled that you're on the call and that you're trying to learn something new, because that is, an aspect of sometimes we don't always feel comfortable going out and trying something new that's not within what we're doing right now. So going back to that job description that I shared earlier, don't even bother to apply if you don't have an understanding of this. So when you're looking to further your own career as well as professional development, maybe understanding risk and how you can manage risk and how the risk appetite and risk tolerance all fits into that might be something that you want to look at more in the future. I did promise you references. All of these, I'll say, are Googleable, meaning that if this exact, you don't have to actually have this exact link to find it. So if you just look up Institute of Risk Management and put down risk appetite, you'll be able to find that article. The COSO actually has several different articles. This one that I picked happened to do with understanding and communicating, but they had several resources that are available for free. PwC was I liked theirs, the way they wrote some things, but it was really specific to the banking industry and the markets. What I liked most about KPMG's, and this was written all the way back in 2008, so this is not a new concept, but it's sometimes new to some of us, and it's becoming more operational, where it had been more of a top management strategic piece. It's now being understood that we have to all understand what's going on with this, not just the top management, for your organization to function better. So I like the KPMG one because they made it very operational and simple to understand. And then this last one was about the framework, and this was Public Finance Quarterly, Hungry for Risk. Again, it was actually speaking to the finance people, but they were talking about operational risks, which I also thought was really interesting. And as far as I'm going to go back and look at the just the news pieces that I did a few minutes at the beginning, so you can take a look at those too if you want to reference those. I would be remiss if I didn't let you know that ICOR does teach about risk. We teach about risk in our business continuity class in ISO 22301 for implementing in our risk lesson. We also teach in our e-learning course on risk management principles and practices specifically. And while in our other classes we don't talk about risk appetite, we do talk about risk. So if we're looking at critical environments like data centers, what's the risk in your data centers? When you're looking at your IT infrastructure, what are the risks to your storage and your capacity planning, and obviously for outages and those sorts of things. But they're not specific on risk appetite. These two courses actually specifically talk about risk appetite. Our classes are also offered in Spanish and Portuguese if you're in the right country, and English in the U.S., and we are working on a French translation as well. Also like to invite you to attend the rest of our webinar series this year. In July, we're going to be talking about storage. In August, about building an incident management capability. We're going to be talking about data, both preserving, protecting, and recovering it in September. And on understanding and protecting against security breaches in October, and then a more general one about resilient workforce. What are we actually seeing in research about resilient people? Who should you be hiring to work within the organization to manage risk throughout the organization and to build a more resilient workforce? So instead of ending there, I just want to go back for 1 minute because we do have a little bit of time, and just to show you. If you wanted to look this one up, all I did was search for risk appetite in the news and then tied that to operational risk to get some of these other ones. So in this one, if you just look at SunTrust and risk appetite, you should be able to find that one. And I believe that was also from this week. And the Manager of the Year was from this week as well. These are all like in the news right now, as well as the analyst job. If you want to go work for Groupon, it's ready and waiting for you there. So I am thrilled that we have a couple of extra minutes. Let me take a look and see what kind of questions we had. The first question says, did risk management in a previous role, not part of the current role? Okay, sorry about that. In identifying risk appetite, how do you usually start the process? Do you need to have a mature risk management program or enough data to identify the appetite and KRIs? Interestingly enough, one of those in the news pieces was actually talking about KRIs, which I thought was interesting, and how they tied that risk appetite to that. How do you start the process? I think it's very simple at the beginning would be to go to management, who's your executive sponsor for your program, who's on your steering committee, and have this conversation and say that in order for you to be able to manage risk effectively in the part of the organization that you're responsible for, that you have an understanding of the organization's risk appetite, and specifically within different parts of the organization. Where are they more willing to accept risk? Where are they not? Because if you're going to try to bring to them strategies for risk mitigation or different solutions, to meet different criteria that you might have, and they reject you right off the top because your strategy or your solution that you're bringing doesn't speak what they want, meaning that they're not even on board with whatever you're talking about because their risk appetite is in a whole different place. So making sure that there's an alignment, you need to understand that. And if you can talk to them about, maybe you haven't done a really good job yet of understanding your needs and expectation of your interested parties. So even identifying who those interested parties are. We've used the word stakeholder in the past, shareholder, stakeholders, who are those people? Looking at what do they want from us? What do they need to know from us? What are their needs? And how do we make sure that we're meeting those needs? Just having those simple conversations, I think, will help you get to risk appetite. The next question had to do with time frame, portfolio, or project, meaning that if you're working on risk appetite, you should be looking at over time. So what project are you working on currently, and what's the risk appetite of that project? Risk appetite can be driven all the way down to project management. So if you're implementing a new project, it's most commonly you see it in IT, for example, that they'll be looking at project risk and what's our appetite for risk within this project. So I think that's part of what they're talking about there. The next question said, if we state our risk appetite as just high, medium, and low, will that not be too generic? And that's part of what I was showing you. I think I agree with you there. When we're looking at the university, okay, when are we going to panic? When are we not going to panic? Where should we spend our money to protect? It gives you some guidance, but there wasn't very measurable, and there wasn't a dollar value to things. So I think having that time aspect, that dollar aspect, and as well as a reputation measurement of some kind. Like, that's why it has to be tied back to those interested parties. Which interested parties are you willing to tolerate risk, and which ones won't? Which ones do you care about your reputation, and which ones do you not care so much about? Is it a student in a university setting, or is it a professor, or is it somebody who's giving your university a bunch of money? So understanding that is going to be important. Let me go down to the next question. So, and I'm not going to promise that I can answer all these questions, but the next one says, since risk appetite should also be measurable, how will it now differ from risk tolerance, considering this tolerance should also be measurable? And I think that's a good question. I'm going to throw out there Linda's opinion maybe isn't the correct opinion, but based on what I've read and understood, is that most people are using the word risk tolerance or risk appetite. And as we saw with the hospital example, they've defined their risk appetite under their risk tolerance statements. And so to me, if you're making your risk appetite statements completely public, you might want to make your risk appetite statements where you actually quantify things, where that you might not want the general public to see. And if you're looking at your organization's mission and objectives, and their taglines and what they say that they do, it's pretty easy to see how you could use your risk appetite to tie to those things. But the actual measurement, like we're only going to tolerate a loss of $100 million. I'm using the word only there kind of sarcastically, or we can only tolerate a loss of $100,000. Depending on your organization, that loss value is going to vary completely. That's probably not something you want the public to see. And you're only willing, you're willing to lose a certain number of people and deaths in your emergency room, but not over a certain number. I don't think that you'd ever quantify it like that, but I think that it's going to be important for you somewhere to have some kind of a measurement for that versus just the high, medium, and low. But high, medium, and low, if you don't have anything, is a good place to start, and it's not so scary. This is a question that says, so would the RTO or your recovery time objective and key tasks of incident recovery mode be like the risk tolerance, meaning we will minimally do these activities without a function within this period of time? And I say absolutely. When you're looking at RTOs and maximum tolerant of period of disruption, or how often you do your backups, your RPOs, how much data can you afford to lose? How many incidents can you afford to have in your information security? That kind of thing. By aligning those to your risk appetite, you have now a direct correlation to making sure that you are meeting the objectives of the organization, and you're not trying to bring to them something that they can't accept. So if you say to them, here's what you've said in your risk appetite, this is what it's going to cost, they either need to change their risk appetite or they need to change the RTOs, and they're going to have to change, what they're willing to pay to do that. But if they say absolutely that these are the things that they have to do, and, making sure that they can get to every person in that emergency room that's critical within a certain number of minutes, then they're going to need to have personnel available to do that. They're going to need equipment that allows them to do that. They're going to have to be able to provide those services, and that's going to come at a cost. The next question's a little bit long. It says, just a bit confused, and that's okay. We mentioned that risk appetite should be measurable, but based on the sample presented earlier, does not have enough information. So I think that's kind of tied to the previous question. Is there any tips or guide we can follow when we should have a generic or detailed risk appetite statement? I hope I just answered that question. I think that's going to be kind of tied to your organization. and how they want to do it and how public they are. If you make your risk appetite statement available to those interested parties, then maybe you want to put the definitions in the risk tolerance. And this is like not a test, by the way. Even if you have an auditor come in, if you put your measurements in your tolerance statements, they're not going to give you a red flag or a nonconformity. They want to know, does your company understand its risk appetite? Does it operate according to its risk appetite and how it then manages risk throughout the organization? So don't be less worried about the actual risk appetite statement than how it is that you're communicating risk and how you're managing risk. And the reason I'm throwing that out there just as a caveat is that a lot of people, and I'll speak specifically to the business continuity space in ISO 22301, just got back in March from our technical meetings where we're reviewing the standard, and there was a ton of conversation about risk appetite and the risk appetite and wanting to change the term to be something else. So that possibility is out there. So I would say that the actual term is less important than the fact that you're doing it. And I'm going to go back to also say the olden days when we were talking about when to declare a disaster. And that measurement of when to declare a disaster kind of was, when do we stop doing business as usual, and when do we move to our alternate site? When do we move our data? When do we decide to fail over something? When do we move our people? All those different measurements, and making that decision comes with a cost because you're now activating things and you're not doing business as usual. So if your organization still kind of operates with the disaster declaration criteria, haven't heard that in a long time, but that's something that people still do, that's going to be a measure for you that should be tied directly to your risk appetite. When is it no longer okay to be operating as normal when all these bad things are happening to us? The next question looks, and I think I tried to answer that with your catastrophic question. I think that's kind of that disaster declaration criteria. The next question has to do with this. I will probably have enough time. I might be able to get through them all, but not sure. How does risk appetite conversation align to small businesses? I think it's actually easier. I honestly think everything that we talk about in managing risk is easier for small businesses. You can just ask somebody in management and they can tell you pretty much right off the bat what they can tolerate and what they can't. Small businesses are simpler. They don't have as much interdependencies. They have a flatter profile as far as infrastructure and as far as people. I think it's much easier. When you're looking at high, medium, and low, it looks like we had a couple new questions come in as we were going, and also other sample risk tolerances. If you go ahead and look at those other references that I gave as far as different articles, they all have more examples in there as well. And honestly, I've been amazed. When we looked at this topic 5 years ago, there was very little being written about it other than the Institute for Risk Management and that article by KPMG. There's been a lot more out there now. So I think if you just do some searching and be real specific about, how to document risk tolerance and how to document risk appetite, you can find more specific information as well. And I just didn't include all of those things because of the fact that this was a webinar and we had a short period of time. So I'd like to thank you all for attending, and just remind you that this is recorded and you can listen to it again on our webinar page probably by the end of the week, and that you'll get a certificate of attendance as well if you're trying to keep your CEUs. Looking forward to having you attend our next webinar. Thank you very much.